a commoner in every sense. He's a scholar, an archivist, and really, I suppose, an activist on behalf of the commons. And he embodies commoning in the way that, in his generosity and his support. I met him a few years back at another deep dive, actually, in Germany. And he has been checking in. We've been checking in on each other. But David has been very faithful to that friendship and very supportive. And I really feel a debt to him and his scholarship. We've lost him.
It's gone.
Is it just the TV?
No. It's just the television, or
Just keep going. Sure.
So he's based at the Center for, I think it's a New Economy at the Schumacher Center in Massachusetts. He'll speak for himself, but I think there's at least a couple of dimensions I think that have emerged, David, during our conversations already, and I think we anticipated some of these aspects when we were preparing for your contribution. There's commoning as a concept or as a way of informing the relationships, the belongings, our relationship with each other, with nature, the alternative economic logics that are at the heart of the commoning idea. But there's also in the context of within which we are meeting in terms of launching this idea of a community of practice. I think a number of us are also drawn to commoning and the commons as a paradigm for the way in which we organize and relate to one another as a new emerging community, championing the idea of the well-being economy. So I'm sure you'll address both of those dimensions, and we look forward to what you have to say. You're very welcome, David. Thank you very much.
Peter. Sorry, just before we started recording this.
Sean didn't get the link.
Sean didn't get it.
I'll send it quickly.
Yeah.
And we are.
So thank you for that introduction, Peter. I'm really thrilled to be part of the group. I wish I could be there in person. I've been loosely tracking a lot of events in Ireland through Peter, and I'm just excited to see these kind of convergences. And I'm kind of energized from the event on I guess it was Thursday or Wednesday with Tim Jackson to get a sense of where people's heads are at on this. What I'd like to do is present kind of an overview context of a lot of the things in the commons so that people can situate themselves in a larger universe of activity. And then I want to get a little more focused and specific on some of the practicalities of both building a specific commons and building what I call the commons verse, and how this entails some shifts of attitude. So I have some slides to make this a little more accessible and vivid with a minimum of text. But I think it'll help. So let me just get that queued up and we'll get going. Okay. Okay. So the onto shift refers to the ontological shift, which we'll get into a bit more, but I consider this at the heart of things. When I was writing my book with Silke Helfrich on this topic, we realized midway through that the received vocabularies and concepts, which were mostly economistic in nature, were just misleading or only half right, and that we needed to make a deeper shift. And once we embraced that, despite not being philosophers or experts, a lot of things just fell into line. And I think that there was a lesson in that for us and for any would-be commoner. So let me just, oops, for some reason, there we go. So the idea is the commons offers a pathway for growing a different world, but it requires to make this ontological shift, and we'll get into that. But two preliminary matters I just want to quickly get rid of is, one, moving beyond the tragedy of the commons, which maybe doesn't require much discussion with this group, but I'll quickly go through that. And second, recognizing enclosures of the commons as a relentless threat. I used to focus more on that with the idea that the state would vindicate the enclosures and stop them. I find that a more problematic challenge, as we'll also get into. The Tragedy of the Commons, of course, was this essay in 1968 that Garrett Hardin wrote that proved to become a cultural touchstone for economists, politicians, and mostly conservative modernists who wanted to claim that the idea was this parable that if no individual rancher or farmer has a rational incentive to hold back from exploiting the collective resource like pasture, and this invariably leads to its overexploitation and destruction, the tragedy of the commons. But this whole idea is not describing a common. So he was describing a free-for-all, what I call the tragedy of the market, in which there's no community, no rules, no punishment for breaking the rules, no governance, and so forth. But basically the tragedy of unmanaged, laissez-faire common pool resources with easy access for non-communicating, self-interested individuals. There's a lot of ideological premises behind the whole story. So we just need to dispense with it and not take it as a serious description of the commons. As Eleanor Ostrom, the great scholar of the commons, proved through her illustrious career, winning the Nobel Prize in 2009 for her both remarkable field work in dozens, scores of locations, as well as her creative theorizing to identify so-called design principles of successful commons. This was her 1990 book, but she wrote many books, of course, and she gave birth to a whole international network of scholars, the International Association for the Study of the Commons, who are meeting actually in Nairobi in June. So they're continue along. They tend to be more scholarly than practitioner-based or activist or politically based, but nonetheless an important part of the conversation. The other aspect I just want to get rid of quickly is how enclosures are a feature of capitalism. Capitalism calls it progress, but of course it's very destructive and dispossessing of people. There's three general responses: the regulatory state, consumer boycotts, and the commons. I see the commons, despite it being very embryonic, as being the most promising long-term strategy, because we've seen quite vividly the failures of the regulatory state, chiefly because the state is too allied with capital and markets. I'll just go through a few enclosures just to give you an idea of the scope of this. One's the great international land grab going on in Asia, Latin America, Africa, in which investment funds, hedge funds are taking over land that traditional people and indigenous people have occupied for generations. This mimics the English enclosure movement. 20% of the human genome is privately owned as patents these days, which of course has inhibiting effects on research and creative solutions to health issues. Some cultural ideas. Disney has sort of propertized and privatized all sorts of cultural stories, fairy tales, and the rest, and used its market power to essentially supplant the folk sharing and open source storytelling that used to prevail. Copyright has expanded so much that the music performance body in the US, ASCAP, started saying that if you were a summer camp of Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts singing around the campfire, that was a public performance that required a copyright license. This is just symptomatic of the vast expansion of property rights, all of which was intended to privatize and marketize culture, such as trademarks, McDonald's going after people who use the word Mick in their names. So this is a really pervasive phenomena of our time, which affects all sorts of different arenas. I think it, of course, doesn't get the attention it deserves because capitalism regards this as development and progress, as opposed to ecological destruction and dispossession of people. So that out of the way for a moment, I want to talk about the commons as a powerful alternative. And we first have to start by realizing that the commons is not a resource the way economists and politicians generally talk about it. They say, oh, the oceans or the internet or outer space is a commons. No, it's a resource in search of commons governance. And that governance is not typically coming through the nation state or international treaty organizations. So it's really more accurate to see the commons as a social system, which consists of the community and the resource and the social norms and practices. And it's more than just sort of bland, open-ended sharing and cooperation. It's kind of a social organism. I put resource in quotes there because, as we'll get into, commoners don't regard their resources as resources, meaning it can be defined by price or it's just this other. It's something that's part of them, which is why we developed the word, we use the word care wealth often to indicate a different category of relationship that people have with their, quote, resource. And it's important to know that commons are really about bottom-up practical experimentation. They're not an ideology. And so they have all sorts of different manifestations depending upon the history, the geography, the people, the type of care wealth being used, and so forth. And it's really more accurate to describe it as a verb, not a noun. There is no commons without commoning, the activity of negotiating, communicating, working out rules, solving problems that goes into it. And this, I think, opens up the space for thinking about it more accurately and relationally, as opposed to commons as a thing. And I like to point out, too, that commons generate value through dynamic living relationships. It just doesn't happen through transactions that are cash mediated, this for that in an even-steven thing. It's more symbiotic and dynamic the way nature itself is. In fact, many eco-philosophers, some eco-philosophers argue that life itself and ecosystems are a commons. And I think that that's sort of the same worldview and mentality that I see the commons in too, as this dynamic living system. So obviously in doing this, in getting into commoning, you're enacting a shift in worldview away from capitalist modernity, and which of course sees value as price, progress as the marketization and privatization and development, quote, of everything, and state power as the appropriate partner of this through its rational, centralized control and scientific expert. But the commons really becomes very subversive because it recognizes a lot of this huge non-market value that living systems generate, which if it's not traded in the market, economists don't regard it as interesting or worthwhile. It's a wasteland or informal, which is why, of course, feminist economics has been so valuable in bringing a lot of this to the fore. Eco-philosopher Andreas Weber really said it nicely, that science and economics are unwilling to acknowledge creative aliveness as an ontological foundation of reality. I mean, if you let that sink in, you start to realize that so much of our ontological premises in science and economics are about moving dead matter around and not even acknowledging the aliveness in ourselves, but treating people as human resources or units of productivity, and so on. And the point, this has occurred to me, it occurred to Silke and I when we wrote our book, that there's this tyranny of archaic worldviews that just prevent us from seeing things. We realized that here I live in Amherst, Massachusetts, and there was a famous geologist in the 1840s associated with Amherst College who was trying to figure out what these footprints in sandstone were, and he thought they were evidence of great flying turkeys. And of course, the idea of dinosaurs or deep time or evolution had not surfaced with Darwin yet. There wasn't even a word for dinosaurs. And he, moreover, saw the world through the vision of creationism in the Bible. And the point is that these worldviews are so constraining that you literally can't perceive and see something different. I think we're sort of in that kind of a moment right now. And it's for one thing, the commons is not seen because the state and the market conceptually and in terms of power are seen as the only two significant forces, and commons are this kind of vestigial, archaic, historical phenomena that isn't really relevant. And I think that's just flat out wrong, but it's not, commons are not culturally legible. They haven't been elevated, or people haven't conferred their recognition and faith in them. So what types of infrastructures and institutions do we need to support our creative aliveness and grow the commonsverse? I think it starts with really realizing that they have to be based on a different ideal of a human being. And it really gets that deep about how we are not just isolated solo individuals, but we're nested within larger communities. Our rationality doesn't define us. There's a whole amplitude of human emotions and feelings and behaviors that are equally important, our embodied knowledge, our collective knowledge, and so forth. So to try to make some of these things visible, I produced this book a year and a half ago, The Commoner's Catalog for Changemaking, which was trying to use the motif, the sensibilities, the Whole Earth catalog from the 1970s to have short modules on dozens of different phenomena that show how the commons is really quite active, extensive around the world. It's just not seen as related. So now I want to go through a handful of these just to give you a quick idea of the scope and diversity of commons out there. You know, people don't realize that an estimated 2 billion people to this day depend upon subsistence commons for their livelihoods and household survival. And I might add, it's not just bare survival, it's simply household needs as opposed to needs met through the market. And of course, these have a lot of significance because they're so ecologically constructive or benign relative to global supply chains for food and other resources. But that's not just in the global south that this is occurring. In North America, Europe, there's also efforts to develop food commons, food sovereignty through a variety of different movements that overlap and are very compatible and synergistic. City as a commons is growing in popularity, especially in Europe, places like Barcelona, Amsterdam, many Italian cities, where it's as a reaction to the absentee investors and the wealthy dictating how the city will be run, as Uber and Airbnb hollow out neighborhoods and suck away money, deadening the city. There's a lot of efforts to try to create urban commons to reclaim some self-determination and liveliness in the city. So that's a whole front going on. Alternative currencies are trying to recapture and recirculate community value instead of that value being sucked out to the major financial centers by enormous investment communities and banks. The open source software explosion has remade the field. Half of it or a lot of it has been co-opted by big tech that uses it as cheap or free inputs, but nonetheless, it also has remained a creatively open field that many can participate in, and it is not as closed and proprietary as it once was. Creative Commons licenses have been a critical tool unimaginably in creating shareable content, images, music, scholarly work, which otherwise is born as private property. These licenses allow the copyright holder to voluntarily signal that the work is shareable for free without permission or payment. So a very significant legal hack on the system and a kind of infrastructure, which I'll talk about some more in a moment. All of this has given a new generation of open source activity called cosmo-local production, where design and knowledge are shared on a global scale, but then there's local physical things being produced, from agricultural equipment to motor vehicles to electronic circuit boards and equipment. Fab labs and maker spaces are often incubators for a lot of this kind of innovation. really has significance for climate change because it would help do away with a lot of carbon-intensive supply chains and allow local autonomy with world-class design. And I think one takeaway of all this is that commons can arise anywhere. There's no master inventory. It's not classified by resources. It can happen in the theater commons in Boston that I howl around, the potato park in Peru, which is a agro-ethnological stewardship of the biodiversity of potatoes, which otherwise might be captured by the ag biotech industry. A regional Wi-Fi system in Catalonia, open source seed sharing, because things have gotten so closed and proprietary in many seed markets. So, this is happening all over in all sorts of different contexts. And one lesson from all this, people often say, well, how do you scale it? I think the next big thing will be a lot of small things anchored in their appropriate scale, but federated among each other, as opposed to centralized or hierarchically controlled through some master commons organization or something. So I think it's the issue is really, as Silke and I used to have described it, emulate and federate is the way we, quote, scale the commons while keeping its appropriate scale and accountability. So let me get more concrete in some of this about how to build and structure a commons. This is the book that I mentioned that Silke and I wrote in 2019, in which we self-consciously wanted to answer what are the inner dynamics of commons. Economics has Homo economicus and this whole mythical theory of how value is created through market transactions. We wanted to know what the inner dynamics of a commons were based on our extensive travels for years and the anthologies we had edited on the issues. And we came up with what we call the triad of commoning, which are a variety of patterns of commoning. And we took the idea of patterns from pattern language. Christopher Alexander, some of you may know, was a kind of dissident urban planner and architect who said, why do certain designs in urban spaces or buildings persist across history and cultures? And he concluded it was this bottom-up social enactment to solve recurrent problems with clusters of different answers. So there's no uniform best practices or perfect way to do it, but rather clusters of commons based on recurrent problems that people face. So Silke and I use this methodology to identify maybe 2 or 3 dozen patterns that occurred in 3 major areas: provisioning of things, peer governance of the community, and the social life of the community. And these are all intermingled, but those are 3 useful ways of conceptualizing how it works. And what's common in all of these is the relationality among people. It's unlike a lot of the common scholarship or economic scholarship. It's not about individuals interacting with things. It's about the relationality of people with each other, with those things or care wealth, and with previous and future generations. So this really starts to make you see the world in a different way. And I struggled with how to maybe try to convey this. And one way I came up with after seeing a slide presentation was, this is a map of the Great Sandy Desert as most Westerners see it. And this is how the indigenous Aborigines see it. It has a far more emotional dimension of how they feel about the landscape, the relationships they have with it, how they perceive it. And I find that, that helps make vivid how I relate to commons in a deeper, richer, emotional sense, and in a greater expressive sense than just cut and dried numbers. And in this sense, the commons is really a world-making enterprise. It's creating a world in the course of managing resources and meeting needs. And I like to think of it as a different politics of belonging as opposed to the centrifugal, disintegrative energy of modern life and economic and capitalism. But it's also about an economics of sufficiency and limits, not endless growth and consumerism. And part of this is achieved by decommodifying the shared wealth, not treating it as tradable commodities, and sharing them based on needs. So I wanted to circle back to some of the patterns just to give you an idea, a flavor for some of these patterns. So, for example, in peer governance, bringing diversity into shared purpose, assuring commoners' consent and decision-making, ensuring transparency, not just disclosure, but in a sphere of trust so that people could share embarrassing and difficult things that are important to the group, and so on. We have a whole set of things dealing with markets and money because markets and money tend to be corrosive of commons by introducing a different logic and motivation that destroys the social solidarity and ethical honesty that's needed. So we have patterns that talk about keeping commons and commerce distinct. It's not as if there can't be any interactions with markets, but you have to be very careful and deliberate about how you engage with markets, or the next thing you know, you'll be chasing the money and letting some outside capital investor or bank dictate how the commons is run. The social life of commons is a kind of glue that holds a lot of this together, in which, well, I won't go through all these individually, but you get the idea of some of the social practices that commons need to enact for them to maintain their coherence, their commitment, their trust, their free, generous sharing of knowledge, and so forth. So all of this adds up to different values and operational logic from the money economy. I've dealt with some of these, but peer governance, fairness is a major theme. You have responsibilities, but they're linked to entitlements, not in a quid pro quo way, but in time, through your belonging to that community, you do get entitlements and benefits. It's about meeting basic needs, not just endless wants. Shared wealth is inalienable. It's not for sale. You don't try to liquidate the asset in the future. You're trying to be a steward of it for the long term. And custom and tradition are very important in all of this as well. And it's interesting, on the one hand, you can have the tyranny of structurelessness and the presumption that you don't need to think about structures, or that it's more egalitarian to have no structures. There was a famous essay in the 1970s by a feminist, I'm blanking on the rest of her name, Jo Freeman, I think it was, talking about how not having structures can delude people into thinking that everything is open, free, and fair, but in fact, that often disguises power relationships and doesn't have a frank reckoning with actual hierarchies. On the other hand, you can have the deadening paralysis of too much structure. A lot of people think, oh, we're a co-op, we're a for-benefit corporation, therefore our problems are solved. But it's really this dynamic interaction between culture on the one hand and structure on the other, and getting those in sync almost in an artistic way, because you need the enough living dynamics going on, but you also need enough structure. So I think that this is one lesson I've learned in the course of thinking and writing about commons. As far as tools for growing the commons, I know you're grappling with how a community of practice ought to be grown. The patterns of commoning, I think, are one place to start. As a supplement, I would say Christopher Alexander's Nature of Order is a useful book. It's applied to architecture and urban spaces, but nonetheless has a lot of deep principles about living systems and design. As I was mentioning in the Tim Jackson event the other day, finding and building enabling infrastructures is really important, because otherwise it becomes this heroic, aberrational reinventing of the wheel every time. It's just too much work. We need infrastructures to normalize the creation of commons. The Open Collective is one sort of infrastructure. It's this web service that does the financial, budget, and tax compliance work for even small groups. It's a business, but its intention is to migrate into a community-owned system after having gotten underway. It's an example of something that's really can enable a lot of small players to do things that otherwise would be prohibitively difficult or complex. Partner institutions can often help incubate a new commons by providing in-kind support. I know the Heinrich Böll Foundation in Germany was very helpful in that regard, and there's other large foundations or large organizations that would like to pivot and change and have something to contribute, but they can't do it themselves. They need commoners. So partnerships with institutions are worth exploring. Relationalized property is a way to think about our resources in a different way, meaning people have affective relationships and feelings. They have traditions and customs related to that property, which means it's not simply defined by its market price or value. I think it's important to realize people have to give of themselves to these resources or buildings or whatever else that is the important shared wealth. And then, of course, attention needs to be paid to the systems for deliberating and the peer governance. There's no single right answer. There are some instructive models that may or may not be appropriate for the project the commons you're trying to develop. But these are a few of the ideas from sociocracy and different ways of interacting in structured ways to assure voice, to assure fairness, to assure serious deliberation. And then finally, I'll just include, there's a lot of people thinking and experimenting with how to engage with the state in constructive ways. This is a fraught idea because the state often is so intent on getting tax revenues or centralizing its power that it doesn't really want to distribute power. It doesn't really want to empower people to have responsibility or delegate under principles of subsidiarity. Nonetheless, the state has its own problems of legitimacy and trust and effectiveness. Some, especially at the city level, are starting to see that there's some value into striking partnerships with commoners who can get their act together. So that's also something to think about. And then I would just leave a few notes here about arts and culture commons that might also be instructive for how you think about things. There are, I again can't go through all of these, but I'd be happy to talk about them if anybody has an interest. But Ruin Group and the Documenta exhibition pioneered, or were trying to pioneer ways to have mutualized control of the exhibition and sale of their work. Instead of having the Documenta as this staging area for capitalist sale of art, they created curation with dozens of invited artists, Occupy style, with assemblies, and were trying to develop their own systems for retailing their works, bypassing the conventional gallery system that rips them off. Many others that might be worth exploring, depending upon how your community of practice may wish to involve. I'm thrilled to hear that the Playhouse is part of these conversations, and it could play an important role in that regard too. One concept that has stuck with me is Václav Havel's idea as a cultural dissident and playwright, an artist himself, a serious artist, about how you move forward in the face of a totalizing system that is repressive and not amenable to civic discussion and persuasion. And his idea was to build a parallel polis in which horizontally you develop the relationships, the systems for meeting your needs, the capacity to be prefigurative of the kind of society you want to be, and to be able to express truth and wholesome values in an honest way without them having to be immediately twisted or co-opted by the dominant system. And I think that this is a nice touchstone or concept to keep in mind for how one builds the commons verse. I think there are three main ideas that I have in terms of building the commonsverse. One is nourish and ontoshift through commoning. The experience of commoning helps shift one's worldview about what's possible. It's not just this cerebral, abstracted, intellectual debate. It's an experiential practice that shifts one's view. Second, you emulate and federate the disparate commons, as I mentioned earlier, as a way to develop a broader horizontal prefigurative society. And three, you develop the commons enabling infrastructures to make it easier and to build on what's gone before so that there's some progressive growth and development in the commons as opposed to repeating something that somebody did years ago. So that's my quick overview of all this, but I'd love to have a larger conversation with your own questions or specific issues. These are my books, all of them except Think Like a Common are available online for free if you just do a Google search. And these we can now talk about any of these issues or questions that may have been raised in the course of my talk. So thank you.